Episode 2, When Authority Replaced Discipleship.
All right, today we're getting into something absolutely foundational. We're going to talk about a critical shift, how the original model of making disciples got turned completely upside down, and how authority, which was supposed to be about service, became a tool for control. This one is huge, so let's just jump right in. Okay, so let's start with the main idea here, because it is so powerful. If you want to build a system of control, the first thing you change isn't money, it's authority. Why? Because once you centralize authority, everything else just falls into place. So how in the world did this happen? How was the model inverted? We're about to break down how the original mission, to create independent, spiritually mature disciples, got flipped to produce dependent followers instead. And you know, this is really the core of the whole issue. And this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? On the left, you've got Jesus' model. It was all about creating mature disciples who could recognize truth for themselves, without needing a middleman. But on the right, well, that's the systemic model. It creates followers who feel like they need permission to obey God. This distinction is everything. One model creates strength and maturity, and the other, well, it creates dependence. Now, to really get how far things drifted, we have to go back to the original blueprint. What did authority actually look like when Jesus was walking the earth? Well, it was really simple. It was always about invitation, never, ever about control. I mean, just look at this list. Jesus taught with incredible authority, right? But he never, ever used it to back people into a corner. He invited them in. He reasoned with them. He wasn't afraid to openly confront hypocrisy, especially from the religious leaders. And this one's a big deal. He welcomed questions. He was never afraid of being challenged. When people didn't get it and walked away, he didn't run after them with threats. He just let the truth speak for itself.
And this quote just says it all. This wasn't some gentle suggestion. This was a line in the sand. Jesus is drawing a crystal clear boundary between how the world does power, top-down domineering, and how his followers should lead. Not so with you was a complete reimagining of leadership. It's about serving, not status.
This comparison just makes it so obvious. Look at the language on the left. It's all about empowerment. Learn from me. Watch what I do. Now you go and do it too. He's passing on the ability to do the work. But then look at the language of control on the right. Let me manage your faith for you. Stay close so you don't start thinking for yourself. One approach creates apprentices who can eventually build for themselves. The other creates followers who are always dependent.
So, if that was the original, beautiful model of empowerment, what happened? Where did things go wrong? Well, in this next section, we're going to look at how this model slowly got corrupted. The very foundation of authority began to shift from the truth that was being spoken to the position of the person speaking it. And this slide shows the heartbreaking progression. It wasn't an overnight thing, it was a slow drift. First, authority stopped being based on the truth someone was saying and started being based on the position they held. Then, the source of truth started to become the office itself, not the scripture. And the final step, the idea that we all test things together, that was replaced with a top-down, enforced submission. It was a slow but truly devastating change. And the consequences of this shift were massive. Leadership wasn't about serving people anymore. It was about protecting the power of the institution. Titles and hierarchies popped up everywhere, creating distance. And getting into leadership became much harder. But maybe the worst part, questions, which Jesus always welcomed, were suddenly seen as threats. The system wasn't about equipping people anymore, it was about containing them. And this historical shift isn't just something we read about in books. It created a pattern, a blueprint for control that is very, very much alive in some places today. So let's look at the kind of language this pattern uses, so we can all learn to spot it.
Do any of these sound familiar? Don't question leadership. Touch not God's anointed. If you disagree, you're in rebellion. These phrases are like the building blocks for a system based on control. And here is the most important thing to get. None of that comes from Jesus. It comes from systems that are terrified of being examined too closely. And really, it all just boils down to this. It's so simple. True biblical authority is confident. It stands on truth, so it invites you to check its work. It can handle being scrutinized. But false authority, it's afraid of examination. It has to be, because deep down, it knows it won't survive it. So what's the antidote? What's the way out of this pattern of control? It's actually refreshingly simple. We just have to go back to the source. Let's take a look at what Scripture actually teaches about testing authority. You know, the Bible is actually full of examples that go completely against this modern pattern of control. Remember the Bereans? They were called noble, not rebellious, for fact-checking the Apostle Paul's teaching against the scriptures. Jesus saved his most intense rebukes for religious leaders who are crushing people with their authority. And Peter himself specifically warned leaders not to lord their authority over others. The message is pretty clear.
And this verse from the prophet Hosea, wow, it's just devastating. God doesn't blame the people for their ignorance. The responsibility for their destruction is placed squarely on the leaders, the priests, for their refusal to teach the truth. When leaders hide the truth to stay in control, the damage is eternal.
So all of this brings us to a really powerful and, I hope, empowering conclusion. Understanding this isn't just an intellectual exercise. It actually gives you permission. It tells you that there are certain kinds of authority that you are absolutely not required to submit to.
So let's be perfectly clear here. You are not required to submit to leaders who say they can't be questioned. You don't have to bow to any authority that puts itself above the Bible. You don't owe loyalty to a system that cares more about the organization than about the truth. And you are free from any teaching that has to use fear to protect itself. Walking away from spiritual control is not the same thing as walking away from God. In fact, a lot of the time, it's how you start walking toward Him.
And for anyone listening who has been through this next point is so important. If leaving a certain leader or a system filled you with this awful, crushing guilt, please hear me on this. That guilt is not from Scripture. It is from conditioning. It's a powerful tool used to keep people in line and protect the system.
And in the end, it all comes back to this foundational promise from Jesus himself. Truth and freedom, they're tied together. Where you find real, authentic truth, you will find real spiritual freedom. Control and fear simply cannot survive in the same room with that kind of freedom.
So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. And let's be really honest with ourselves. Have I ever accepted a teaching just because of the person who said it, their title, their charisma, instead of actually doing the work of testing it against the Bible? It's such a vital question for all of us to ask.
And here's a practical step you can take this week. Don't just take my word for any of this. Go read the Gospels for yourself. But try to read them with fresh eyes. And pay close attention to how Jesus responds when people ask him questions. And then notice who he confronts the hardest. Here's a hint. It wasn't the sinners. It was the religious authorities who were abusing their power.